what we want to discuss today is the moral costs of war. And of course, the war has immediate physical influence on everyone. It causes immediate physical damage to, civilian lives, to civilian infrastructure, and the scale of that physical damage is, of course, unprecedented. Frankly, it's sometimes really the amount of physical damage that is currently being inflicted upon the civilian population of Ukraine is, by the Russian armed forces is unprecedented in many ways. But perhaps we also should be thinking about what the war does to minds, what happens to people's morals, to people's ethics, what sort of shattered worldviews we might be getting as a result of this. And this is, I thought, something we could really discuss on the Remembrance Day, a rather fitting topic. We could discuss the situation in Ukraine, and we could also discuss it in the broader context, thinking about other conflicts, what we might have learned from those other conflicts, and to what extent what's happening in Ukraine can be helped by that experience. Our panelists today are Revd Andrii Khomyshyn, whom you see over there on the screen. He is the military chaplain of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and he's working with all sorts of people, cadets, soldiers, and others on the front. And here in the room, we have my colleague in Durham, Revd Dr Brian S, who's been involved and has been leading the recently founded Center for Urban Injury at Durham. So I'm hoping maybe perhaps there'll be a chance for Brian to tell a couple of words about what the center is actually doing. As I said, we're expecting some other people, but in the end, we might have a smaller group. So as a Ukrainian, I wanted to say, first of all, that or remind the general public that the war in Ukraine has been going on already for some time. So the general public has become aware of what's been going on usually since February this year, whereas the ongoing warfare has been going on since 2014. So it's already quite a significant amount of time. At the same time, I think we are only beginning to comprehend what influence this has on the society. The Ukrainian society remains rather unusually united in the face of the aggression. That's the situation now. So all the surveys show that there is a really unprecedented trust in state institutions and also in the civil society. And the same surveys also show that sort of feelings of anger or guilt or shame are quite marginal. Still, even in the social media and even anonymously, but maybe that's just the situation now. And I mean, when we and the other panelists met a couple of weeks ago to talk about what we wanted to focus in this debate today, Tetiana Stawnychy, the director of Caritas Ukraine, unfortunately isn't yet present, mentioned one thing that really struck me. That really struck me, and that was, she said, we are all still in the state of shock. And I think that is something that's quite significant. So we are dealing with the society that is currently in the state of shock. Now, what will happen to this society once it starts to come out of that shock? Will it change? And even today, we thought there might be people who are having all sorts of moral issues, moral dilemmas, and perhaps we should be thinking about what those really are. I see now that thankfully, Professor Oleksii Makarenkov from Zaporizhzhia National University also managed to join us. Welcome, Oleksii. That's excellent. We are very happy that you could join us. And of course, after thanking everyone at Durham, I wanted to particularly thank all the participants, especially those in Ukraine, because that these are really very difficult times. So what we're going to do is we're going to listen to panelists speak from their own experience of different groups, dealing with working with different groups in Ukraine. And also, hopefully, we're going to also think about the broader dimensions and how what is happening in Ukraine might be comparable to other conflicts, and whether we can learn from these other conflicts in some form, whether we can help Ukraine with the experience that we've gained from these conflicts. And we begin with a short statement from Professor Mike Snape, who's a Michael Ramsey Professor of Anglican Studies at Durham, who's been really instrumental in this event taking place, and generally very helpful in the establishment also of the Center for Moral Injury. Unfortunately, he can't join us today, but he's recorded a short welcome, which I'm going to play to you now.
Today, for the first time since November 1944, we mark Armistice Day with a full-scale, high-intensity interstate conflict raging on the continent of Europe. The war in Ukraine has already cost tens of thousands of lives, has displaced millions, and has marked, physically, emotionally, and morally, hundreds of thousands of combatants. No matter how just the cause, it is inevitable that many will emerge from the conflict with the troubling awareness of their own moral compass having been shaken or even lost. We were reminded of this earlier this year, in which we saw the 40th anniversary of the Falklands War, a period of reflection in which the BBC broadcast Our Falklands War, a frontline story. Here, British veterans of the Falklands War, including Terry Wood, a soldier from Tupara, who had previously been offered a place to study music at Durham University, spoke candidly about their experiences. And for Terry Wood, the war shook his most basic moral assumptions. Brought up a Catholic, the experience of killing Argentine soldiers at close quarters at Goose Green, young men like himself, and also fellow Catholics, was a moral as well as a psychological shock that troubles him to this day. After the First World War, Hensley Henson, then Bishop of Durham, reflected on the effects that the war seemed to have on his diocese. Its public burial grounds, he noted, were often in a deplorable state, attributable, so he believed, to the morally corrosive effects of war on so many demobilised veterans. Having seen what he termed the horrifying violences inflicted on human bodies by modern weaponry, such familiarity had, Henson thought, corroded our standards of right action in time of peace. The importance of recognising and mitigating the moral damage wrought by conflict is the theme of this evening's gathering. I very much regret not being able to be with you this evening, as I am speaking at a memorial service in Oxford. However, the evening promises to be both sobering and illuminating, an evening in which the moral repercussions of the conflict will be discussed from the perspectives of a Ukrainian military chaplain, a Ukrainian academic lawyer, the president of a prominent NGO working in Ukraine, and by Durham University's Dr Markian Prokopovych and the Revd Dr Brian S. Siegfried Sassoon famously wrote of the hypocrisy of cheering crowds, who will never know the hell where youth and laughter go. This evening gives us, fortunate as we are in our peace and security in Durham, an opportunity to reflect on the depths and the costliness of war, and to better understand one of its less recognised, though very real dimensions.
Right. So I'd like to move on and now ask Andrii Khomyshyn. Andrii, could you tell us about your work with military cadets? You work with soldiers. As far as I understand, you work with others. Could you tell us about the kind of work you and other military chaplains do, and what sort of moral issues or moral dilemmas people you work with might be facing?
First of all, hello everyone. I'm sorry for my English. I'll try to be as much as is possible clear and
Very
short
clear.
in my sentences. So I'm a military chaplain in the National Army Academy in Lviv. Okay. So I just had a meeting with our cadets 1 hour ago, and I asked them, what should I tell to British people about the situation in Ukraine? What are your suggestions?
Okay.
But with the help of our foreign for Britain nation, we fight successfully, and this day we even liberated our one of our biggest cities in the south of Ukraine, Kherson. You probably had it in the news. All day we our soldiers and our civilian people who are um, who are meeting our soldiers, our troops who enter the liberated city, who suffered from occupation for 9 years. And now we have one of the biggest victories in this war. I hope it won't last victory, and finally we will liberate our all south and east and the Crimea Peninsula, Donetsk and Luhansk. So today we are happy, but I wouldn't say it's like happiness, total happiness, because we understand the cost of this victory. How many people, how many our soldiers were fallen, and how many civilian people were killed by Russian soldiers and our enemies. And as a priest, what are my thoughts about the situation? Of course, at the beginning of the war, many people came and they were blaming God. How could he do this? How could he just let those things happen? But now I can see that a lot of our people, they still come to church, because church, we didn't just try to answer them and give them some just talking. We tried to help. We tried to give all necessary they need, in not only answers or not only words, but our church, Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, is like a part of global church, like part of Catholic Church. We used all our our parishes all around the world to help, with asking them to help our soldiers, our people, and thanks God and thanks for their charity. We did a lot, and we still do, and that's why the attitude of our society, of Ukrainian society, to church is, I would say, is pretty good. Our church, not only Greek Catholic Church, Ukrainian Orthodox Church, they play a very important role in our Ukrainian society, and as it was always, especially in our previous how would I say, previous centuries, especially when we for our freedom, when we in the middle of last century and in the beginning of the last century, First World War, Second World War, our churches, they took very they played very important role in this in our fighting for freedom. And finally, after 30 years of independence of Ukrainian state, we are starting to realize us as the United nation who is just it's like birthday of our nation. And I would compare our situation with the situation of Great Britain in 1940. It is really close for me, as I understand. It's very close, the situation of Great Britain and Ukrainian, because we are fighting with one of the biggest military forces in the world, Russian military force. It was big. Now it's less, much less, because of our brave soldiers, and I would say brave society, because we, you know, even imagine that our society is so brave, and we are reaching those victories also with the help of your nation. And I would like to express my gratitude for you and thank a lot for your support and for your understanding of our situation. So finally, we are becoming a united nation, a part of real European culture and history, as we was always before, and I hope we will be in the future.
Thank you. Thank you very
You're welcome.
much. Well, it is of course very interesting to hear how, originally some people might have come with doubts about God or about the system, but somehow, I guess one thing that we might be aware of is that you need the existence of specific institutions and specific structures, like, for example, the church chaplains, to help people deal with these issues. Now, can I move on to Professor Makarenkov? Oleksii, as an academic, I mean, you're an academic, you're a lawyer as well, and you're based in Zaporizhzhia, which is, quite close to the front. Does moral damage have a legal dimension? Can it be measured? Do you think lawyers can help the society to heal from moral issues? What is your opinion?
I am cordially grateful to Professor Markian and very appreciate the management of the law school of Durham University and the management of Durham University for the organization of this scientific event within the direction of scientific collaboration with our university. I'm very glad to see a student academic environment. It's very inspiration me. According to the problem which touching during this event, I want to outline that the topic is quite conceptual and capacious, taking into account the efficiency of spending time. I do not touch the empirical data on the moral condition of the Ukrainian citizens during the war. Let me touch upon the impact of this condition on legal relation. I'm have prepared a presentation, and if you let me share it, I could to share this presentation for more easily understanding.
Okay, how do I do this? You have an idea?
Without share screen?
See if you can you share?
I could, thank you.
Okay.
Please. Look, my topic of my report is correlations of good virtues and law determined by war, the case of Ukraine. As Attlee noted on October 26th this year, Dr. Christopher Salba from Durham University Law School, the scientific claims are conditioned by the civilization context. Verification of the accuracy of data and or the effectiveness of decision depends on the historical condition of people's lives. The social context determines the invariance of actions and decisions. I am divided my report on three parts. It's legal historical prerequisites, where I described it, situation, social situation, and some historical outcomes which formed based for before the war and determined the war eventually. The second part, its differences in relation to the dangers of war and its overcoming. And the last part, it's correlation of citizens' moral legal losses from the war. Because we have limit time, strictly according instruction of Professor Markian and other management of these events, I want to only stop on my conclusion. I think that according to my opinion, moral suffering as a result of war arises the fear of being offended, from the fear of violence against friends and relatives, the consequences of the crime, the need to participate in proving the crime, that this crime was committed, the duration of such jurisdictional processes, the feeling that guilty persons may remain unpunished. Suffering will be a consequences of the impossibility of achieving justice for those victims who are dealing with the irreparability of what has been lost. For instance, in the case of death, disability, mental trauma. After the end of the war, those representatives of the Ukrainian nations who actively fought for human and national values will seek to manifest these values everywhere and always. This is possible if human virtues will dominate. Organizational spread of good virtues is possible if citizens hold public position by calling according to their abilities, talent, and not through bribery, like it's spread in Ukraine, in Russia Federation, in Belarus, and so on, unfortunately. This social political system should correspond to Lee Kuan Yew well-known statement, namely that a public office should not only be filled by the most capable person for the job, but should be in it for as long as he or she is effective. And the last, psychological recovery and fair satisfaction are also important socially. Without it, the war will not be over. In this connection, the creation of appropriate conditions for forgiveness of criminals and military aggression on the part of victims becomes key. The cumulative formation and manifestation of the action of all these factors will take at least a decade. The process of reconciliation and peaceful development is facilitated by the repentance of the enemy. For example, on December 7, 1917, Willy Brandt, well-known person, as the Federal Council of Germany, knelt before the monument to the victims of Nazism in the Warsaw ghetto. The suffering of honest citizens, their injuries, and other losses from the war in Ukraine became a real trouble for them. The tragedy of the war was the result of the irresponsibility for unscrupulous citizens. Moral and other psychological recovery after the war for the entire Ukrainian nation require qualitative changes in consciousness in the form of a valuable rethinking of one's existence. An important place in this, the conviction and of the steady movement of Ukrainian citizens to the legal standards of the high-tech economic formation of the European Union, which is possible only on the basis of permanent dominance in legal relation of human virtue, not vices. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. This was very informative and very interesting to hear. Now, I think, of course, as has been mentioned in this in the presentation, it might take years for these new legal structures to get established. So one of the things we might be thinking about is, now what about the time in between? Who is going to help people deal with the moral issues before those legal mechanisms get established, when they get established, if they get established, and so on and so forth. Now, I do see someone else among panelists. Tetiana, are you with us?
Yes, Markian, I wasn't able to join through the Zoom link, so I called in. So I'm sorry you can't see me, but I am with you. Mm-hmm.
That's great. That's so good you could join us. So can I then go on and ask you a question, Tetiana? So, you know, you lead a major charity that's been involved in Ukraine for a number of years, but you work with perhaps different groups from military chaplains. You work with families, with refugees, with orphaned children. So all of these might have been affected by the war in a different way. Can you tell us, how what sort of moral issues or moral dilemmas people that you work with are facing or mentioning, and how do you help them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for the question. So again, I work for Caritas Ukraine, and we have a network throughout the country. We've been operational from the first day of the war on February 24th, responding to the needs of people on the move. So people who are displaced, also to refugees who are heading to the borders. We've seen that over time with every wave of IDPs, the people are more and more vulnerable. The people who fled in the beginning were those who felt comfortable, more comfortable, I think, leaving and traveling across the border. And the people who stayed behind were those who were more, for some reason, more attached to where they were living. So again, we've been seeing this vulnerability growing over time. We've been working throughout the country, again, both in our centers, where we have now large numbers of IDPs who have settled around each of our centers. We also work in the eastern part of the country, close to the contact line, also in liberated areas, providing basic needs to people in need. But, you know, I think what I'd like to share a little bit about, though, is, again, how we live through that as an organization. And we experienced this from the very beginning, that there was this huge, you would say, explosion of solidarity inside the country. And in the first days when the war erupted, actually our centers were filled with volunteers and also with people bringing supplies. So warm clothes, food, you know, offering something hot to drink, a place for people to spend the night and take shelter. And this amazing, I would really call it an amazing solidarity. I would say that it's continued. Yeah, of course, the you know, humanitarian aid, as time goes on, it goes deeper. It starts approaching questions of psychosocial support, we've been creating places for children, child-friendly spaces from the very beginning, and now those programs are going deeper again, where initially we would just provide space for a child to be able to unfreeze a little bit and start to act like a child, feel like a child again. Now we're able to work a little bit more in depth with the children, helping them to work through trauma. But what we're finding actually through our work is that there's something healing, yeah, that happens by reestablishing a connectedness. So between the recipient and also the giver, yeah. And you know, if you think about war, and if you think about an attack, yeah, what does that do? It rips at the very heart of what we're created for, which is we're created for relationship. Yeah, and so it rips at relationship, it rips at trust. And it seems to me that in the Ukrainian society, we're seeing this amazing expression of taking that step that heals that, yeah, because it's reaching out and helping one another, is helping to recreate a connectedness. And we find very often that when many of the IDPs who come to us, you know, they'll get that sense of community, you know, that empathy that, you know, that we offer when they come to us for help. There's an order in the way that we provide the help that I think is also healing, yeah, because again, war, when people are fleeing, it creates chaos. And in the way that we provide assistance, it provides order, yeah, it introduces order back into life. It introduces connectedness. And it also, we find that, you know, if you look at the situation in Ukraine, it's not only, you know, everyone is affected by the war. Yeah, so it's an attack on the country. Yeah, and everybody feels it. And I have the sense that very often inside of Caritas, whether it's our staff, very often the displaced people who come to us initially for aid, they become our volunteers. Sometimes they also join our staff as well, and serve other people. We find that there's something healing that comes in this offer of assistance to another, this going outside of yourself. It creates an agency in you, yeah, that, again, that war tries to destroy a sense of agency, and this helping one another recreates it. And we find that on all levels. You know, so I can give you an example of, there was one young woman who she was already a displaced person twice, from the first time when the war started in 2014, and then now again. And she told me this story. She said, you know, I really felt this time I just completely was broken apart. My heart was broken. into two pieces, and I was just lost. And then she made her way to Caritas. She got some help from us, and then she joined us as a volunteer, and now she's a staff member working as a caseworker, helping other IDPs who are fleeing. And she was telling me that with every single person that she helps, yeah, she feels like a piece of her heart gets put back together, yeah? That it's being sewn back together, and that there's this kind of a restoration and a healing. And when I think about the future as we're going, I think that solidarity and those expressions of practical love and of help to one another will be a really big part of healing and working through the traumas.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tetiana. Brian, you're an expert in moral injury. How does all what we've heard, does that ring a bell? I mean, is the Ukrainian experience in any way, does it appear very unusual? What other things we should be aware of?
Sure. So just at the outset, maybe to set forth what we mean by moral injury for a moment, to give us some framework for what we're talking about. This term really has come into use in the last 30 years or so. Generally, there's a US psychiatrist named Jonathan Shea who's credited with bringing it into the modern discourse. And Jonathan Shea studied Vietnam veterans in the United States, and a lot of his work came from that. So it was a situation that I'll describe being very different from this one in several ways. But Shea found that moral injury was present when there had been a betrayal of what's right by a person in a position of authority in a high-stakes situation. And so in the military context of direct combat, those are fairly easy to understand. The soldiers encounter so many different situations in which either their application of violence or non-application of violence often has life and death consequences for sometimes a great number of people in any given situation. But Shea argued, though, that moral injury is present there, so that even those acts of violence, especially in situations where there's a sense of betrayal, can cause all kinds of people to feel moral injury. Direct actors and the soldiers, civilians, bystanders, and certainly victims of violence and those that survive, all affected by this idea of moral injury. It's generally understood to come about and be recognized as the presence of ongoing and lingering negative moral emotions. So guilt, shame, contempt, anger, their experience, but also can be marked by a lack of broken social trust, very strong feelings of self-condemnation, and really an inability to make meaning of their lives. Agency was a big word Tetiana just used. The loss of agency, that anything I do matters in the world, and really kind of a lack of ability to process those things in a meaningful way. So the war in Ukraine, obviously, you see a lot of those potential features. A few things that I think are that we've heard just from those who presented about the situation are certainly positive factors in the Ukraine that can serve as some bulwarks against moral injury. And we know these kind of things. Again, very different from Vietnam in the United States, where American society was extremely divided about the conflict. And certainly returning soldiers had extremely negative experiences of being judged partially by civilians on their return. And so that sense of social cohesion that everyone has mentioned certainly is helpful, particularly going through the conflict in this stage. Tetiana had mentioned in a previous conversation, as Markian has already said, there's a sense of still being in shock. But what we know about moral injury too is that we need certain things to feel human, that we associate with our own humanity. Safety, just the security that we're not vulnerable at every minute. The idea that we have a community, that we have relationships that are trusted, and critically, in a legal perspective, the expectation of justice. In conflict, you can see all those things here hang in a somewhat precarious balance. Those are in jeopardy, every one of them. And the work that Tetiana is doing, you can hear how they're rehumanizing and restoring some of those elements in a really beautifully embodied way. So when people come in and they testify to their own experience and kind of the horrors of their own trauma there, and can find a community that's supportive, and healing that reintegrates, that provides space for children to play, that provides space, time, and support and consistency is really valuable in kind of serving as a bulwark against that. The fact that we're already talking about, that Oleksii's already talking about structures of justice and understanding the challenges that come with that. That's certainly a huge factor that's positive in kind of warding off some of those aspects of it. As Father Andrii said, the idea that the church there is participating in helping, not by offering some grand theological vision, but by just taking care of what needs to be taken care of, by taking care of immediate needs. All those things help really mitigate against what we know can happen. An examination of whether the church's theology supports the war that happens in the it's happened in the UK over the course of both world wars. Those kind of divisions can certainly alter things and make life more difficult. So the fact that, again, all those structures are together and seemingly united in building and maintaining that social trust, that's a big deal. And that's those are important positive factors. Certainly brilliantly, Tetiana talked about the idea of healing essentially by finding our own sense of empathy. We know that that's a profound way of healing moral injury, and that actually in a healthcare context, physicians and other healthcare workers that have been suffering moral injury from the COVID pandemic are finding and really working through that sense of empathy for others is what sustains them and serves both as a bulwark and a healing mechanism for moral injury. All those things really resonate with the frameworks that we know about moral injury and are wonderful things. There's certainly a few things, challenges, I think, that lie ahead to that if I want to talk. And I say this, just these are frameworks of things that we know from conflicts that seem to be enduring factors that we see time and time again. So this is nothing, these are some of the things that there's nothing to mitigate. There's nothing that can happen to fight these off. These are just experiences that happen after conflict, and we know that. First, certainly, as Tetiana mentioned, the restoration of agency. One of the things that can be really destroyed in conflict is the sense that one can make decisions that have meaning. Certainly for soldiers fighting on the front lines of combat, you're part of an overall larger will. And even when that's very integrated, it can feel like my agency has been co-opted into this larger thing. And discovering one's own voice and agency again will be something to work through for returning folks. With the work that Tetiana is doing, it's wonderful in taking care of all those that have sought refuge. And certainly to me, though, it strikes me there's two big groups, though. There's that group that's experiencing social reintegration, that is experiencing safety and security again, and that's wonderful. Eventually, though, they're going to encounter a reintegration of soldiers who fought on that front line. And what keeps them going, that we know, just not speaking to the specifics of Ukraine, but what we know about soldiers, what keeps them going amidst the difficult things that they have to do, killing others, constantly dealing with death, uncovering, as we know, liberated villages, discovering the horrors that have been perpetrated in a lot of those are morally traumatic, regardless of the cause. We know, regardless of the situation, that here there's not really another choice but to go to war. There's not a lot of other option. Even in what we call good conflicts, where those situations present, that doesn't mean people have an easy time. That doesn't mean we as human beings find it easy to kill others and deal with death and destruction on a massive scale. The way soldiers often process that is by connection with their own unit. When they're in units, there's such a solidarity within that unit, such a solidarity within that cause. And eventually that's going to be broken up inevitably by the survivors and those that return home. And so those that are reintegrating with their families, who hopefully have encountered places like Caritas that have built up that sense of social trust, they'll have theirs ripped away again and have to reestablish that. The other thing we know often is that what differentiates moral injury from post-traumatic stress is something of a delayed reaction. We know post-traumatic stress is about the fear we experience in situations up front, and we feel that immediately. in very stressful life and death situations. And so post-traumatic stress is often the body's learned adaptation to those kind of environments, just being kicked off in smaller stresses. And so it has to reacclimate. But that moral reflection on what we're doing, we know takes place often long after. So there'll need to be continued attention just to the witness to the destruction and the violence, to those who partake of it. Even in unified causes, for example, we know the number one way that militaries basically get and influence their members to kill others is by dehumanizing the enemy. I've heard from different people, this does take place in this conflict among Ukrainians. They have a particular slur they use for Russian soldiers, and that serves them well in those situations when they don't need to think about what they're doing. They can think of them as invaders, they can think of them using those slurs, but often on the front lines, what those soldiers will experience is the humanity that the people they've killed are often 18, 19-year-olds and much younger. And especially in cultures as close as the Ukrainian and Russian that have so much cultural overlap and similarity and identity markers, they'll realize that despite that dehumanizing name, the bodies that represent lives that were very similar to theirs. And that's a lot to deal with, and that will be a traumatic experience that will be in the outcome of this. So I think what we can learn from some of the what we know about moral injury is basically now some of the things to watch out for and know that these things will be experienced. One of the best things we can say is, in acknowledging some of that, is that this will happen. We know that, we can expect that, and at least have some things in place. Again, the work that all three of the folks we've encountered tonight are already doing, but just with the expectation of some of the ways that those additional frictions and moral traumas are going to occur later.
Thank you.